The small coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Main stands as a curious anomaly in downtown Chicago. Neither trendy nor outdated, it exists in that perfect middle ground where conversations matter more than aesthetics. Rain beats against the windows in steady rhythm, creating a natural barrier between the philosophical sanctuary inside and the hurried world beyond. Steam rises from ceramic mugs, dancing in the warm yellow light that bathes the wooden tables and mismatched chairs. In the far corner, two men sit across from each other, one elderly with a receding hairline, broad nose, and penetrating eyes that seem to look through rather than at his companion. He wears a simple white button-down shirt, frayed slightly at the collar, and speaks with measured cadence. The other, younger but still middle-aged, sports a distinctive full beard and intense eyes beneath a prominent brow. His dark coat remains buttoned despite the warmth inside, as though permanently prepared for confrontation. They should not be here. They cannot be here. Yet somehow transcending time and space, Socrates and Karl Marx find themselves sharing coffee in 21st century America. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper as the scene unfolds. "What fascinates me," Socrates says, swirling the remaining coffee in his cup, "is how your modern society still struggles with the same fundamental questions we pondered in Athens. How should people live together? What constitutes justice? Who should rule and by what right?" Marx leans forward, his intensity palpable. "But you miss the material conditions that shape these questions, Socrates. Your approach was always too abstract, too detached from economic reality. How can we discuss living well in society without addressing who owns the means of production?" Socrates raises an eyebrow. "Perhaps I begin from different premises, my bearded friend. Before we can address structures, we must understand virtue. What good are perfect economic systems populated by unexamined souls?" "Souls?" Marx scoffs, though not unkindly. "Your idealism blinds you to concrete reality. People are shaped by their material conditions, not abstract virtues. A worker laboring 16 hours cannot pursue your precious self-examination." A young woman refills their cups. Neither philosopher acknowledges her presence, too engrossed in their emerging debate. Socrates takes a thoughtful sip. "Then let us start with what we can agree upon. What is the purpose of society? Is it merely survival or something greater?" "The purpose," Marx considers, "society should enable human flourishing without exploitation. Currently it does the opposite. The capitalist class extracts surplus value from workers who create all wealth. True freedom remains impossible under such conditions." "Freedom," Socrates repeats, testing the word. "We valued freedom in Athens, though perhaps differently than you conceive it. I would argue that freedom begins within, freedom from ignorance, from unexamined assumptions. The truly free person knows themselves." Marx shakes his head vigorously. "Self-knowledge means nothing when you lack bread. Material needs come first. Your philosophy serves those already privileged enough to contemplate abstractions. The masses need economic liberation before philosophical awakening." "I walked barefoot through Athens, engaging laborers and aristocrats alike," Socrates counters calmly. "Truth is not reserved for the wealthy. In fact, wealth often obstructs wisdom by fostering attachment to appearances rather than reality." "On this we might partially agree," Marx says, surprising himself. "I too believe wealth, specifically capital, distorts human relations. The bourgeoisie cannot see beyond profit motives. They mistake money for value, markets for freedom." Outside, the rain intensifies. Lightning briefly illuminates their faces, one questioning, one resolute, as thunder punctuates their exchange. Socrates leans back in his chair. "You speak of classes as though they are fixed entities. In my dialogues, I sought to transcend such divisions through shared inquiry. Perhaps you divide what should be united, and perhaps you unite what history necessarily divides," Marx retorts. "Class conflict drives historical progress. The slave revolts against the master, the serf against the lord, and now the proletariat must overthrow the capitalist. This dialectic cannot be resolved through conversation alone. Yet here we sit, conversing." Socrates observes with subtle irony, "Is dialogue not itself a form of dialectic? Through thesis and antithesis, might we approach synthesis?" Marx almost smiles. "You appropriate my terminology surprisingly well for an ancient Greek. But dialogue alone changes nothing without action. Philosophy has only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it." The coffee shop grows quieter as evening customers depart. The two philosophers barely notice, locked in a conversation spanning millennia, their fundamental question still unanswered. How should we live in society? Tell me this, Socrates asks. In your ideal society, what becomes of the individual? Does the person dissolve entirely into the collective? Their voices fade momentarily as the narrator observes their contrasting postures. Socrates open and questioning, Marx passionate and certain, both utterly committed to their vision of human flourishing, though separated by incompatible first principles. What began as chance encounter has transformed into intellectual confrontation, with the very foundations of social life hanging in the balance. The coffee shop is emptied now, save for the two philosophers and a barista wiping down counters with practiced motions. The rain continues outside, drumming against the large front window, where city lights refract through water droplets, creating small universes of color that neither thinker notices. You asked about the individual, Marx says, breaking a momentary silence. The bourgeois notion of the individual is a historical construct, not some eternal truth. What you call individuality, I see as alienation, people separated from their species being, from meaningful labor, from their true social nature. Socrates folds his hands together. You speak as though history determines truth, rather than merely contextualizing it. Is there nothing transcendent in your worldview, nothing eternal about human nature? Human nature is not fixed but fluid, Marx insists. What appears constant is merely the expression of economic relations in different epochs. The autonomous individual you cherish is really the atomized worker under capitalism, stripped of communal bonds. The barista approaches, informing them the shop closes in 30 minutes. Both men nod distractedly. Let us be concrete, Socrates suggests. Imagine we advise a young person seeking to live well in society. What would you tell them? Marx considers this practical framing. I would tell them to recognize their position within class dynamics, if they are workers, to unite with fellow workers, to understand that individual advancement without systemic change merely perpetuates exploitation. Their personal struggles are political and collective, and I, Socrates responds, would urge them to question inherited assumptions, including those about class and historical inevitability, to examine their own motivations and beliefs. A just society requires just individuals who know themselves. Self-knowledge without material analysis is empty, Marx counters. Your approach lacks historical context. The philosophical problems you wrestled with in Athens reflected slave-based economic relations, not timeless questions. Socrates sips his now cold coffee. Perhaps certain questions transcend economic conditions. Does not every human, regardless of class, confront mortality, seek meaning, struggle with virtue and vice? But how these questions manifest depends entirely on material conditions, Marx insists, tapping the table emphatically. Death means something different to the exploited worker than to the leisured aristocrat. Meaning itself is shaped by productive relations. You reduce too much to economics, Socrates says. The human soul has dimensions beyond production and consumption. The questions I asked in the marketplace of Athens about justice, knowledge, courage, resonated across social divisions. Marx leans forward. Because certain ideological constructs serve ruling interests across different economic systems. The ruling ideas of every age are the ideas of the ruling class. Then dialogue becomes impossible, Socrates observes, if every idea merely reflects class interest. Yet here we are, reasoning together despite our different perspectives. Outside, the storm has begun to subside, raindrops falling more gently against the darkened windows. The barista has disappeared into the back room, leaving them momentarily alone. What about power? Marx asks suddenly. Your dialogues often involved powerful men of Athens, yet rarely questioned the slave economy underpinning their leisure. How can philosophy ignore such fundamental inequalities? I questioned everything, Socrates replies calmly, including the assumptions of powerful men. It led to my execution, if you recall. But I sought to understand justice itself, not merely its manifestation in particular arrangements. Justice cannot be abstract, Marx insists. It must be materialized in economic relations. Worker ownership of production is not merely desirable, but necessary for justice. Socrates raises an eyebrow. You speak with remarkable certainty for someone who claims all knowledge is historically contingent. How do you know your conception of justice isn't similarly limited by your own historical position? This gives Marx momentary pause. Historical materialism provides scientific understanding of social development. I analyze existing contradictions to identify necessary resolutions. Science itself emerges within historical contexts. Socrates points out. Perhaps your certainty resembles the dogmatism I encountered in my own time, claiming knowledge where only opinions exist. Marx's expression darkens slightly. My analysis is grounded in material reality, not abstract speculation. The contradictions of capitalism are empirically verifiable. As were many beliefs I questioned, Socrates replies. The point is not whether observations are accurate, but whether the conclusions drawn are warranted. Your leap from economic analysis to historical inevitability requires examination. Their voices have risen slightly, drawing a curious glance from the barista who has returned to finish closing duties. What frustrates me, Marx admits, moderating his tone, is your focus on individual virtue when collective action is necessary. Capitalism cannot be overcome through personal reflection. And what concerns me, Socrates responds, is your subordination of individual consciousness to collective identity. Does the person disappear into the class? The question hangs between them, neither fully satisfied with the other's framing, yet both recognizing the seriousness of their interlocutor's concerns. Perhaps, Socrates ventures, we might find some common ground in practice, if not in theory. Marx nods cautiously, his intense eyes indicating willingness to continue this impossible conversation across centuries. The foundations have been explored, their fundamental differences exposed, yet something compels them forward. A shared conviction that how we should live in society remains the essential question. The barista approaches their table with apologetic reluctance. Gentlemen, we're closing in 5 minutes. Marx glances up, suddenly aware of their surroundings. Perhaps we could continue this discussion elsewhere. Minutes later, they walk side by side along rain-slicked sidewalks. Streetlights cast long shadows as they pass closed storefronts and late-night diners. The urban landscape of concrete, glass, and steel surrounds them, a physical manifestation of the society they debate. This city, Marx observes, gesturing broadly, embodies capitalist development. Workers built these structures but own none of them. Their labor congealed in buildings they cannot afford to enter. Socrates observes passers-by hurrying through the night, some in business attire despite the late hour, others in service uniforms, a few in tattered clothes seeking shelter. I see people of various stations, yet all seem equally disconnected from one another. Is this alienation you speak of? Precisely, Marx nods approvingly. Under capitalism, social relations become relations between things, not people. Human connections mediated by commodities and capital. They find a small park with benches beneath a protective awning. Sitting down, they watch raindrops create ripples in puddles reflecting city lights. Let us address governance directly, Socrates suggests. In Athens, I questioned democracy when practiced by the uninformed. What political system emerges from your analysis? The dictatorship of the proletariat, Marx answers without hesitation. Not dictatorship as you might understand it, but workers' democratic control of state power to prevent counter-revolution. Eventually, the state itself would wither away. So the state is temporary, Socrates asks. This contradicts much of what I've observed about power. Those who gain authority rarely relinquish it voluntarily. Marx frowns slightly. Under communism, administrative functions would remain, but class-based political power would disappear as class itself disappeared. Government of people would become administration of things. A beautiful vision, Socrates acknowledges, but I question whether human nature permits such harmony. In my dialogues with Glaucon, we explored how justice must account for human tendencies towards self-interest. Again you invoke eternal human nature, Marx sighs. What you call human nature is largely the behavior conditioned by capitalist relations. Change those relations and human behavior transforms. A police car passes slowly, its officer eyeing the two oddly dressed men conversing in the park after midnight. Both philosophers pause until the vehicle continues onward. Even here, Marx murmurs, the state apparatus maintains property relations through surveillance and force. Yet that officer might also protect the vulnerable, Socrates counters. Institutions contain contradictions, serving multiple purposes simultaneously. Now who sounds dialectical? Marx asks with unexpected warmth. They share a moment of connection despite their differences. Two thinkers committed to understanding society's deepest structures, separated by millennia, yet united by common questions. Your ideal society eliminates private property, Socrates states. In my conversations with Athenians, I often questioned excessive attachment to wealth, yet never advocated its complete abolition. What distinguishes legitimate possession from exploitative ownership? The crucial distinction is between personal property and private ownership of productive forces, Marx explains. One may own items for personal use, clothing, shelter, tools, but private ownership of factories, land, resources that others must use to survive, this creates exploitation. So, ownership becomes problematic when it generates power over others, Socrates reformulates. Perhaps here we find agreement. I too questioned arrangements that corrupted souls through improper power relations. A homeless man shuffles past their bench, pushing a cart containing his possessions. Both philosophers watch in silence, their theoretical discussions suddenly contextualized by lived reality. In your dialogues, Marx says quietly, did you address material suffering directly? Did philosophy offer solutions to hunger? Philosophy alone feeds no one, Socrates admits. Yet without examining what constitutes true flourishing, we risk pursuing false solutions. Athens had wealthy citizens who remained miserable despite material comfort. But they had the luxury of such misery, Marx points out. Material needs must be met before philosophical needs. Unless, Socrates suggests, philosophical understanding helps determine how material needs should be organized and distributed. Without wisdom, even well-intentioned economic systems may produce injustice. The rain has stopped entirely now. Above the city lights, a few stars become visible, ancient light reaching them across vast distances, much as their conversation bridges centuries. What troubles me about your approach, Socrates continues, is its determinism. If history inevitably moves toward communism through class struggle, what role remains for moral choice, for the individual seeking to live virtuously amid imperfect conditions? Marx considers this carefully. Historical forces create possibilities, not certainties. Individuals make history, though not under conditions of their choosing. The point is not to wait passively for inevitable change, but to consciously participate in necessary transformation. Then perhaps our positions are less opposed than they appear, Socrates suggests. We both believe in conscious engagement with social questions rather than blind acceptance of existing arrangements. Marx nods slowly, though his expression indicates awareness of their still substantial differences. Yet I maintain that collective action addressing material conditions must take priority over individual philosophical journeys. Socrates gazes upward at the clearing sky, and I maintain that without examined lives, even revolutionary change may reproduce old injustices in new forms. Neither can fully convert the other, yet both have discovered unexpected resonances across philosophical traditions. Their conversation has moved beyond simple opposition into productive tension, revealing how different starting points can still lead to shared human concerns. Dawn approaches, painting eastern skies with subtle hues of pink and gold. The city begins stirring, early commuters hurrying toward bus stops, delivery trucks rumbling down still quiet streets, cafes raising metal shutters to prepare for morning crowds. Socrates and Marx have wandered into a small waterfront park, where Lake Michigan stretches toward the horizon. They sit on a bench facing the water, physically tired but intellectually enlivened by hours of continuous dialogue. I have been thinking about your concept of alienation, Socrates says, watching a solitary gull glide above gentle waves. Though our frameworks differ, perhaps we both recognize that contemporary society disconnects people from something essential. You might call it species being. I might call it self-knowledge. Marx nods thoughtfully. The modern worker is alienated from their labor, its products, their fellow humans, and ultimately themselves. Your dialogical method, at its best, attempts to reconnect people with examined understanding, though I maintain this remains insufficient without structural change. And perhaps, Socrates offers, your structural analysis, while necessary, remains insufficient without individual transformation of consciousness. Systems are comprised of persons who must recognize justice to implement it. A jogger passes, earbuds inserted, eyes focused on a fitness tracking device strapped to her wrist. Both philosophers observe how technology mediates her experience of the natural setting. Look at these modern people, Marx says, gesturing toward early morning commuters visible in the distance. Constantly monitored, measuring themselves against external metrics, their time commodified. This quantification of life represents capitalism's colonization of consciousness. In Athens, Socrates reflects, I questioned those who claimed expertise without self-awareness. Today, perhaps people claim self-awareness through devices that actually prevent deeper examination. The unexamined digital life is proliferating. This observation draws unexpected laughter from Marx. We find common ground in our critique of modern alienation, if not in our prescribed remedies. The rising sun now casts long shadows behind them, illuminating their faces with warm light as the conversation reaches toward conclusion. If we were to offer shared wisdom, Socrates proposes, to those seeking to live well in society today, what might we agree upon despite our differences? Marx considers this carefully. Perhaps this, that uncritical acceptance of existing social arrangements serves those who benefit from current inequalities. Whether through philosophical questioning or material analysis, existing conditions must be examined rather than naturalized. Yes, Socrates agrees, and that genuine human flourishing requires both internal and external conditions. Neither philosophical awakening alone nor structural transformation alone proves sufficient. Additionally, Marx adds, that meaningful connection with others constitutes an essential aspect of human life, whether conceptualized as political friendship or non-alienated social relations. And finally, Socrates concludes that justice remains worth pursuing despite its complexity. Whether through dialectical examination or historical struggle, the question of how we should live together deserves our sustained attention. A diverse group of early morning exercisers has gathered nearby, preparing for group yoga facing the lake. Socrates and Marx observe how these strangers form temporary community through shared practice. I wonder, Socrates muses, what perspectives we've both missed through the limitations of our historical positions. What wisdom might emerge from voices excluded from Athenian discourse and 19th century European philosophy? A valid point, Marx acknowledges. The dialectic continues beyond us. New contradictions emerge requiring new analyses. The conversation extends further than either of us could have anticipated. They stand simultaneously, aware that their impossible dialogue must conclude as morning fully arrives. Workers cross the park toward office buildings, a microcosm of the society they've spent the night dissecting. Despite our fundamental disagreements, Socrates says, extending his hand, I recognize in you a fellow seeker of truth, committed to human flourishing. Marx clasps the offered hand firmly, and I acknowledge that your commitment to questioning represents a form of resistance to dogmatic acceptance, even if differently framed than my own. As they part ways, neither has abandoned his core principles, yet both carry expanded understanding. Their debate, spanning millennia, economic systems, and philosophical traditions, represents not resolution, but productive tension between complementary insights about how humans might live together. The narrator's voice fades as the two figures walk in opposite directions, eventually disappearing among morning crowds, their temporary convergence across time having illuminated permanent questions about justice, community, and the examined life in society. The philosophical dialogue between an ancient questioner and a modern revolutionary dissolves back into the realm of imagination. Yet the questions they explored remain urgently present in the social arrangements surrounding us all. How should we live in society? The conversation continues.